As a kid I wondered why he was such a zombie, and when I got older my father told me what happened to him. I would probably be an emotional husk too. Redditors who lived in secluded towns, what's the darkest thing that has ever happened in your town that everyone knew about but never talked about? Hey viewer, thanks for coming back for another dark storytime with your favorite narrator Andrew the Automaton. Today's story is going to be pretty dark and graphic, so it may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. Before we start the video, why not like the video, subscribe, and ring the bell button so that you don't miss any more scary storytimes like this one with me. With that being said, let's get into the stories. Girl in my neighborhood was tied to a tree, raped by multiple boys, and left there overnight, completely naked. Until one of the neighbors found her in the morning. No one talked about it. Nothing was ever done. The cleaner at my old primary school hung himself right in the middle of the hall where all the assemblies and such took place. Needless to say, school was cancelled for a few days. A man committed suicide by shooting himself 3 times in the head. Not everybody knows he was murdered, and the police helped cover it up. Edit. Also, the 3 shots were all over his body. Only one in the head. Recently divorced father went to ex-wife's house, killed her and her new boyfriend, then shot himself, all in front of his kids. Also, another guy kidnapped a girl, killed her, raped her dead body, then chopped her up and dumped the remains. Edit. This is 2 separate people. Somebody owned a pub and killed his wife and bricked her into the wall. She was reported missing. 30 years later they were renovating the pub and found her, but at that point her husband had died. Family up the road from me seemed like nice people, always friendly, owned a business within the area, everyone knew them. But they all seemed kind of off or strange. I don't want to use the term, but it was apparent they were all a variation of slow to a degree. One day news broke that the father had been sexually molesting his 2 daughters, I think 17 and 13 for God knows how long. Guy was never formally convicted due to lack of evidence, so he remains an outsider now to the town. I believe his kids were sent to CPS immediately. About 9 years ago, a guy lost his job at a nearby Kaiser, so he killed his 5 children and wife, and then turned the gun on himself. Before he shot himself he faxed a letter to a news station, explaining that the tough economic times we were living in left him no other choice. He also apparently indicated that he and his wife had agreed to this murder-suicide pact weeks before it happened. They had pulled their older children out of school and everything. A decently popular Chinese restaurant in town had one of the owner's babies walk out the back door and disappear. It was ducking heartbreaking, the parents on TV, and all in the paper. There was a big search effort. Eventually they found the baby's body stuffed into one of the cabinets at the restaurant. The mother had beaten the baby to death. I looked into it. She's serving 22 years then being deported. The place is closed. My dad getting arrested for child abuse was the giant scandal. Pretty much everyone was supportive for the most part, which I don't hear a lot of for small towns. Landlord went easy on my brother for rent until he got situated. People would periodically bring food to check on us, and it never felt like gossip. I used to live in remote Australia. The body of a girl about 17 to 18 turned up in the middle of nowhere. I mean nowhere. The nearest house was 40 km away. The road was red dirt. Some drovers found her nearly decomposed. No one knows who she is, no one knows where she came from. The only theory they have is that a river flooded and brought her down from Darwin, and she's more than likely an international tourist. We don't talk about it because there is literally no town and no one in it to talk about it to. A girl at my high school went missing. Then about 2 months later the paper ran a story about how a local girl was abducted, taken to Mexico and gang raped, sodomized and several other graphic details. That girl showed up at school. She was there about 5 minutes before everyone connected the dots and she had to leave. It was sad as crap at the time. It's even sadder now that I am grown up and understand what happened. My small town paper is an asshole. 2 terrible things occurred. A very popular boy hung himself from a swing set in a town park. He was 17. At that time there had been a couple suicides of young boys in our area, But this one really took people by surprise. Funeral was terrible. He had one older brother and a sister. About 3 or 4 years later, the older brother hung himself at the same place on the anniversary of his brother's suicide. Terrible. My friend's 21 years old sister was murdered in her house on Christmas. Came home from celebrating with family to find someone robbing her house. He beat and murdered her with a baseball bat. Ended up to be a kid she went to high school with. He ended up killing himself in jail. It's been 10 years and it's still difficult to talk about. I live in a small town in the middle of a few small farms. One of the farms has a sort of greenhouse flower shop. One of the owner's sons committed suicide in the greenhouse. Later that year, the father went into a field just outside of town and shot himself. His body was found by some kids going to school. Nobody talked about it. Edit. I'm actually from Canada in a very small town, only about 700 to 800 people. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everything about everyone, even without people really talking about it outside of their own homes, hence how I found out. The screenshot of Belle Plaine is interesting because I live near a town called Belle Plaine, but I'm not the same one. It's crazy how many similar stories there are. In my hometown, there was a girl who hid her pregnancy from everyone. She gave birth in her family home while everyone was out, but hemorrhaged and fainted. Her dad found her and took her to hospital, where they proceeded to ask him where the baby was. He didn't know she was pregnant, but went back to the house to find the baby. He found the baby in a bucket in the cupboard. She had stabbed it multiple times with manicure scissors. She claimed it was dead on delivery, but the autopsy proved otherwise. She was arrested and spent a few months in a mental institution before being released back to my hometown. Most depressing story time ever. One of the biggest and most notorious cases to hit my county was when 2 teenage girls were hit and killed by a driver who fled the scene. This post reminded me of this story because one of the girls had parts of the driver's license plate imprinted on the backs of her thighs. That's how hard she was hit. The driver was drunk, went home after the crash, asked her son to hide the vehicle, but first he needed to crash it into a pole to create some damage to cover up the hit and run damage. The kicker? The girl who had the license plate partially imprinted on her thighs was the daughter of the drunk driver. The driver hit her 14-year-old daughter and her best friend and left them to die in the streets. I don't think she knew who the girls were when she hit and ran, but damn. She got 8 years. Also, I live in weed country in Norsel, and we have a lot of locals and non-locals who flock to our remote and rural hills to trim wheat on the black market. We have an epidemic of missing and murdered women, including indigenous women, and most of those murders simply go unsolved. It's pretty terrifying. In my town, a man molested his 4 daughters, as well as forcing them to watch him and their mom having sex. She knew all about it but said nothing. They all had a slight intellectual disability as well, ranging from the lower end of normal to an actual slight disability. Child services had been notified, but since CPS told the family they're visiting beforehand, they always pretended everything was fine and nothing happened. It only got out when the youngest daughter, who was about 5 at the time, was at a friend's house and asked her and her mom if their first time hurt that much as well. I went to school with one of the older girls, and she used to lie a lot and had to cover for her dad a lot as well. When she was about 12, she was out of school for a few days and had some weird cover story, but it later turned she was getting an abortion because her dad got her pregnant. Really ducked up story. Not in my city but in my family. My great-uncle Norm was a Vietnam veteran, and he brought home a sweet Vietnamese wife. They were very happy for some time. He taught her English, and she was very crafty. They had 2 sons that he loved very much. When the sons got older, she became jealous of how much time he spent with them and how much he loved them. She became mean and resentful, spiteful. He started finding old meat and bugs in his lunches, and when he started bringing his own lunches, she would stalk him at work and try to give him lunches she made. She started ripping apart the house for him to come home and clean up and didn't feed her sons, even though she was the housewife. He filed for divorce, and when he left for work, after handing her the papers, she stabbed her sons to death, doused their bodies and herself in rubbing alcohol, and lit herself on fire. He was absolutely devastated. As a kid I wondered why he was such a zombie, and when I got older my father told me what happened to him. I would probably be an emotional husk too.
Like and subscribe for more funny, interesting, and scary r/ask Reddit videos.